Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Gio and Joey Show. Um, I have good news for myself. I bought myself a house. We closed today. And so I'll be streaming from a new studio sometime in September. We're getting the house painted first before we move in. Joey, how you doing?
Better than I deserve.
Amen. Actually, I might be meeting Joey for the first time in a couple of weeks. I'm going to his neck of the woods in Michigan. Joey, let the
Yep.
audience know what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about, well, kind of two topics. One, we want to give a shout out to a great Substack, religiousliberty.tv. I would recommend everybody check that out for kind of updates on the state of religious liberty. A lot of good information there. But there's one article that particularly stuck out, something that, again, and I like how he even said in the article that it's not the mark of the beast, anything like that, but it
Mhm.
is something that happened in the news that kind of shows how the Bible, like things that we would have thought like how's that going to happen, like we took it by faith or whatever, is like, oh,
Mhm.
could be a step, but it has to do with money.
Yeah. Money, money, money. What does the Bible say is the root of all evil?
The love.
The love of money, exactly. But what does, it's interesting that you bring that up before I put the article up. I've always been fascinated because, I used to, I like finances and I deal with that. I'm a Dave Ramsey certified coach. I used to have my registered investment license. I dabbled in that for some years. It's always fascinated me how in the Bible God says you can't love God or mammon,
Mammon.
which is basically the concept of wealth, right? Money. Out of all the things he could have compared himself to, right? You can't love God more than your family, or you can't love God more than your job or your nation, it was money. Why? Because everybody deals with money. Either you ain't got enough of it, or you got too much of it, and you're greedy for more, or you're stealing for more, or whatever. And so it's interesting that Jesus spoke about money more than he did any other topic. And the mark of the beast revolves around what? You can no longer buy or sell, which is money. And I think this article, like he says, and you pointed out, isn't that this issue is the mark of the beast, but that it at least makes you go, as it's setting up the pressures of Revelation 13 and 14. I'm going to put the article up. I don't know if there's any space specifically or just to give them a shout out. This is what it is.
Well,
Let me
first,
go ahead.
just saying that
No.
sparked in my mind, but it's like the fact that Jesus did point that out, right? That you can't
Mm-hmm.
love money, God and money. Well, that's what the final crisis comes down to, right? The issue
Mm-hmm.
isn't money, the mechanism that we're talking about here, but it's ultimately going to be is like, are you going to worship God as He says to worship Him, or are you going to go along with the beast system and dishonor God? Right? So it's going to come down to, are you going to worship God or your economic security?
It's funny you bring that up. Not funny, but theologically speaking, the mark of the beast you can get it in two spots. You can get it on your forehead or in your hand. And the biblical significance of that is, mind you, God seals you on your forehead. Just one spot, the forehead, because the frontal lobe is where you make your decisions, your choice. You have to willingly decide to follow God. But the mark of the beast comes in two forms: one in the forehead, which are those people who deliberately and willfully want to follow the beast, are part of the beast system, are the ones themselves getting other people into the beast system. And then there are those who get the mark of the beast on their hands. And those are the people who haven't learned to live by faith, who look at the economic pressures, like unfortunately during COVID, where people ended up violating their conscience by getting the shot. And this is not about the shot per se, but they violated their conscience getting the shot because they were afraid of losing their job and how they were going to sustain their families. Look, nothing should force you to violate your conscience. And that was, to me, in a sense, a precursor of the type of economic pressure that Revelation 13 and 14 speaks about. And this kind of, I guess, muddies the water or kind of opens a pathway for that kind of economic pressure to come in.
Mm. And so I won't rehash everything in the article. You put it up there so
Mhm.
people can see the title and they can go and read it. But just kind of the short
Well,
story, right?
let me read this for the audience, and then, like I said, we're not going to rehash the article. This article explains a new law quietly signed on July 18th could reshape how Americans use money. With digital dollars now tied to personal identity and monitored by private firms, it raises urgent questions about privacy, access, faith, and a threat to financial freedom. Whether or not it leads to outright persecution, it builds a system in which the ability to buy or sell can be made conditional, not by law, but by quiet corporate consensus. Elaborate on that for the audience.
So there's certain things that are interesting. First, just to clarify, right? Without like, I don't want to go down like too many conspiracy rabbit holes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying President Trump, who signed this, or the legislatures that supported it in a bipartisan way, have ill intent, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
digital currency here, Congress wants to regulate them. But as with most things in the technological age, it's a matter of the technology progresses and comes into existence and even prominence in society before we have any idea what the ramifications and how that's going to
Mm-hmm.
alter society. Right? Nobody thought in 2007 that smartphones would be as ubiquitous as they are now and how used for everything, or that when social media was launched, no one saw that it was going to cause all this addiction and all this other stuff, right? And that's what happened with this stable coins and all this stuff. It sounds good, right? It sounds like, oh, it's decentralized money. The problem is, as he points out in the article, any transactions with these digital coins, especially after this Genius Act, are going to be
Mm-hmm.
tied to a account, right? A personal wallet, which therefore makes the transactions inherently traceable. And as we can see, I mean, we've already seen, right, banks, right, even without this, right, we've seen banks deplatform people. I know
Mm-hmm.
credit, have decided, we don't like the NRA, and we think they're prone to violence, whatever, and so we're not going to give credit to the NRA. So we've seen that
Didn't
used for
something happen to the artist? What's his name? He goes by Ye. Kanye
oh,
West, right?
Steve
Did
Bank.
Yep.
And I don't like Kanye's, Hitler stuff, and I don't like Nick Fuentes. I think he's
Mm-hmm.
awful. But the idea that these institutions, right, that deal with people's money, the idea that they can just deperson you as far as finances and whatnot is concerned for your political views, I think that's concerning, right? And the thing is, stuff like that always starts with people who it's easy not to defend, right? Like, in other words,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
desire to defend the views of Nick Fuentes. I think he's
Mm-hmm.
awful. I think rapers, racism, I think it's bad. But he's still a person, right? He has a right to property. He has a right to money, right? And so, and we can also see where this leads. What's to stop once this kind of thing is out there and this stuff can be traced? What's to stop, before, like just something recent, what's to stop Christian, businesses from being stripped of their financial resources, or their ability to do transactions because they have an unfavorable view of LGBTQ issues, right? That's just one thing that comes to mind. Obviously, we know, in the final crisis,
Mm-hmm.
how economic is going to be leveraged against commandment keepers.
You know, there's a notion here, right, in the United States, and even still now, like this is really hasn't brought the ramifications yet, but that you could donate money anonymously, right? That notion where even if it's a transaction, through the internet, right, you can give it to a church who then donates it to somebody anonymously. With this digital stuff, though, you can never really truly be anonymous. Yes, the general public, But the banks and whoever, right? So let's say if your money's with Bank A, well, Bank A knows who it is who donates to the political party. Bank B knows because it received it, and anything in between. And so you really never have the ability to donate anonymously. And what happens, as you mentioned, if I donate to my conservative church, right, globally, and let's say in a liberal state, in a blue state, um, they start cracking down on it. And so it just opens up, for no other words, Pandora's box. And people don't know. And we're not saying it's going to happen, but the mechanism is there for abuse. And if you ever have the mechanism for abuse and you have humans tied to it, there's always going to be some sort of abuse. You're too young for this, but when the Patriot Act was passed, many conservatives, many people, even on the left, had concerns about its potential abuse of power. And we have seen since then that it's been abuse of power. Snowden, right, was a whistleblower in that sense. Others, and even till today, we have less freedoms under the guise of protecting the nation than we did prior to 9/11.
Yeah, and I definitely think, well, if we get into Snowden, that could be a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
Um, but I certainly agree, right, that the Patriot Act, um, particularly when it comes to the unlimited, like,
Surveillance powers.
without a warrant, right? I think that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, absolutely something that we should also talk about along these same lines. I don't know that it's ever going to be repealed, but if it could be reformed, particularly strengthening the need for a warrant, I think would be good. Recognize that people have a certain right to privacy. I think online,
Mm-hmm.
but again, the court has, just like with your physical stuff, if they think you committed a crime or they have or reason to suspect you of one, they can go to a judge, or they should have to go to a judge, and it should be for specific things. Where with the Patriot Act, basically it loosened that, and they could get much more broad
Mm-hmm.
warrants, right? I forget what the word is, but it's like where it's like a catch-all, right? So they're looking at Joey, and but then they happen to see Gio's private stuff here, and so now we're looking
Mm-hmm.
at him, and so that definitely needs to be tightened. Now I
It's
don't actually
it's funny
almost
you mentioned that real quick, right? It's almost like with this surveillance powers, you're guilty by association, right? Because let's say you're the one they got a warrant for, and you're doing something illegitimate, but because we have a show together, or because we're part of the same denomination, now they are, you know, checking everybody in our connection. And it shouldn't be that way. If they got a warrant for you or for any individual, it should basically stay in that scope.
yeah, I would just say I think Snowden is a bad spokesman for this cause, which I do think is a
Mm-hmm.
legitimate, because in other words, he's not actually a whistleblower, right? He
Yeah,
released
yeah.
information, threatened people's actual lives. People had nothing to do with this, and then right, he sought asylum in a country that is far worse as far as these things is concerned, and stuff like that. So again, it's a legitimate cause, not the best.
Yeah, I bring him up mainly though because he did expose some things. So whether whatever his intentions was, he did open the eyes, you know, to certain abuses going on here. Um, as far as Revelation 13 and 14 and how this article can tie in, it's a notion that there's going to be economic pressure in the last days, and that economic pressure is of the kind that doesn't only affect you personally, the adult, but it's going to affect children, right? And the heartstrings. Let's say you're a mom, single dad or single mom, and you have to choose between taking the mark of the beast or buying food for your 10, 7, 4-year old. Those are the ages of my kid. And, you could see their ribs already because crisis has been happening. The conditions of Revelation 13 and 14 make it sound like it's not going to be, business as usual. And unless your faith is planted, you're going to give in just to go along to get along. And these digital systems in the article make it too easy to do that. Because right now, you could donate cash to somebody and nobody is privy to it except for you and the person you donated. And that's the freedom of a cash society, which you don't get in a digital society. And Big Brother is always going to be watching. And even if they improve the regulations of the Patriot Act, it's hard. It's just human nature to want to give up power and that type of surveillance. So I don't know. Any thoughts before we transition?
Yeah, just to leave people with some hope, right? We do believe these things are going to happen, right? There's going to be a
Mm-hmm.
crisis. Daniel, I think it's Daniel 12:1 says that it's going to be a crisis like never was,
Yeah.
right, before. Um, but we know the end of the story, right? We
We
know that
win.
our God is coming back for those that are
Mm-hmm.
faithful, for those that
Mm-hmm.
him. And I think there are some practical things that you can do to have some self-sufficiency, right? In other words, if you have some land, make sure you know how to garden, make sure you know
Mm-hmm.
how to, raise chickens, right? These kind of things. But the thing that I think is more important is that you're focusing on your daily relationship with God, so you're building that trust,
Mm-hmm.
but also that you're living the Christian life in your community, right? That the people in your community know you as a peaceable person who cares about your community, that you're, you know what I mean? And the first reason to do that is because that's what we should do to be more Christ-like, and that's our call as Christians. But secondly, it'll influence people for Christ, which is our number one commission, really.
Mm-hmm.
And third, when the final crisis comes, right, when accusations are made against the commandment keepers, against those who love God, right, and won't worship the beast system, even if the courts are saying, hey, he's a danger, the people in your community are going to be like, well, wait a minute. That's the guy who went out of his way, to help
Mm-hmm.
my guy who, was always volunteering in our community, right? In other words, in the final crisis, it'll actually help them see because,
The
Jesus says
contrast.
Jesus says that the times that are coming are going to be such, and the deception is such that even the very elect would be deceived if time was long enough. But God
Mm-hmm.
will cut it off. But when that happens, right, as we understand, right, the close of probation ends for like sincere Christians first, right? God is, and then those who have the truth ultimately. But then those that weren't aware of the stakes, they'll have a moment before their close of probation, and your influence during the final crisis, doing your own persecution,
Mm-hmm.
could tips the scales for them to choose Christ. So I just think that's important to keep in mind as we have this discussion.
Well, I mean, you look at the stories of the martyrs, right? The blood of the saints are the seeds of or the blood of the martyrs are the seeds of the saints. Your testimony, you never know who's watching. And if you're faithful to the end, God can use that for his glory. Before we switch on this article, I wanted to read the conclusion of what he says, what it means for everyone. And this is based on the Genius Act that was passed on July 18th. This is not just a story about technology. It's about who controls access to money and under what conditions. The Genius Act passed with bipartisan support and very little public debate. For now, it is being presented as a modernization of the US financial system. But the deeper question is whether it opens the door to a future where using money requires approval, where privacy is no longer part of the transaction. As regulators write the rules and as more Americans move toward digital payments, a consequence of this law will become visible. For now, the system is in place The challenge is whether anyone will draw the line before it begins to draw itself. And that's basically the tone of the article, right? It's saying, look, let's keep an eye on this because there's potential for abuse. We haven't crossed that line yet, but basically when you're dealing with human nature, the potential is there and we need to be vigilant. But we never go back, right? Liberties lost are never truly ever recovered. And we're in the digital age. And so the ability to control it, even for a national crisis, right? Because it's always for the greater good, right? The view is always, oh, we're doing this for the greater good. Well, it's set up to and it's funny because if they were doing this for guns, like digital guns, for the safety, like we could turn them off if a criminal gets a hold of it. Well, they could turn it off for the criminal. They'd be able to turn it off for the patriot. And it's the same thing with this digital currency. Any last thoughts on this before we move?
Well, just on the vigilance part, right? As my boy Ronnie R. Said, right? Freedom is not passed to our children in the bloodstream, right? It's never more than from extinction, and we have to fight for it, right? In every generation, right? We have to teach those values. So.
Yep. All right. So the next, we're going to transition here to something that happened in my former state that I love, Texas. And it's a notion that, in a sense, ties with this money issue, in a sense, because it ties with Revelation 13 and 14. I want to play the first clip. I'm assuming it's a short clip, and then we'll discuss.
My granddad was a Baptist preacher in South Texas. I've been going to the same church since I was 2 years old. And now I'm in seminary studying to become a minister myself one day. My faith means more to me than anything. I agree with what some of my Republican colleagues said yesterday. Faith is not just a private matter. I speak very openly about my faith in public. My faith is the reason I'm in public service. I believe we need more conversations about faith and morality in our society, not fewer. There is a spiritual crisis in our world that must be addressed, but this bill is not the way to address it. The separation of church and state doesn't just protect the state, it also protects the church. But every session we pass bills that erode this sacred boundary, replacing school counselors with untrained chaplains, using tax dollars to fund private Christian schools, teaching Christian Bible stories to our youngest, most impressionable students. And just yesterday, letting public school teachers use their authority to encourage students to pray. And now this bill, a bill to mandate the 10 Commandments in every classroom across the state. I think all these bills come from a place of fear. We're worried that people aren't coming to church like they used to. I share that fear. On Sunday mornings, I look across my church and I see a lot of gray hair, and I worry about the future of our church. But I firmly and passionately believe this is not the way to get people back to church. This is a power play. By using our power as legislators to elevate our faith tradition over all the rest, that's the kind of stuff that gives us Christians a bad name. Instead of living out the way of Jesus, we're imposing our beliefs on other people by force. Instead of leading by example, we're leading by mandate. If the goal of this bill is to create a whole new generation of Christians, I think this bill will do the opposite. I think this bill will create a whole new generation of atheists who think our religion is more about power than love. I love the 10 Commandments. I've tried to build my life on the 10 Commandments. But what does it mean to truly live out those 10 Commandments? The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 13, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. The Hindu student who sits in a classroom is our neighbor. The Buddhist student who sits in a classroom is our neighbor. The Sikh student who sits in a classroom is our neighbor. The atheist student who sits in a classroom is our neighbor. And we are called to love them as ourselves. But if this bill passes, we're going to put a poster on the wall of that classroom that says, thou shalt not worship any God before me. We're putting up a poster that says their religion is inferior. We're putting up a poster that says their faith is not welcome here. It's hard to be different as a kid. I bet each of you remembers a time that you felt left out, a time when you didn't fit in. We've all experienced that. It's the loneliest feeling in the world. It's why so many of Jesus' teachings are about outsiders and outcasts, neighbors who don't fit in. Forcing our religion onto Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and atheist students is not love. Forcing teachers to put up a poster in their classrooms against their wills is not love. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Love is the fulfillment of the law. I'm voting no on this bill, not despite my faith, but because of it. I'm voting no on this bill out of love for the Ten Commandments, out of love for the Constitution, and out of love for our neighbors. And I humbly ask you to do the same.
All right. That's a portion of the bill.
So let's play the next clip.
Yeah, okay. Hold on.
Quick, and then
trying to set it up. All right.
Oh, good. So far, I agree with everything you said.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Open up. There we go.
What is the fourth commandment?
Keep the Sabbath.
Part of keeping the Sabbath holy is not working on the Sabbath.
That is, yeah.
What day is the Jewish Sabbath?
It is on Saturday.
And what day is it today?
It is Saturday. Here we are.
The Christian Sabbath is what day?
Sunday, in honor of the day that Jesus rose from the dead.
And we're scheduled to give this bill a final vote on what day of the week?
It's ironic, isn't it?
Would you be willing to postpone your bill so that we're not breaking the Ten Commandments by working on the Jewish or Christian Sabbath?
I love that you said that, because
you're saying that you'd rather tell people to follow the Ten Commandments than follow it yourself?
I would rather have had this bill passed the other day when it was time.
Oh, I love that. Because the irony, right? Do as I say, not as I do, is basically her attitude. And look, he admitted he goes to church on Sunday, but he recognizes that the Ten Commandments says the seventh day. He called it the Jewish Sabbath, but then quickly pivoted and said also Christian Sabbath. Your thoughts on that particular clip?
Yeah, well, so like I said, I also liked it. And here's the thing, and we're going to show a couple other clips from this Texas representative, but what he is bringing up here is important, right? There is a separation of church and state, right? In that the state doesn't have authority, and we've talked about it plenty on his channel. It doesn't have authority to do certain things, right? There's a realm that it's actually blasphemous for the state to enforce because it has to do with our vertical access to God.
Mm-hmm.
But also, what he kind of brought up here too in the Sabbath clip, which is the reason why I wanted to share it, is because it goes to the core thing, right? In other words, on one hand, they say that the Ten Commandments from the Old Testament must be displayed. But on the other hand, they want to say that the Ten Commandments were nailed to the cross, and that's why it doesn't matter that the fourth commandment says the seventh day. Really, it can be Tuesday or Thursday, or as Christian tradition has it, Sunday. But then if that's true, if the commandments are malleable, then why are you wanting to enforce them on people anyway? Right? Mm-hmm. It's this dichotomy, yeah.
You know, it's the notion of do what I say, not as I do. Many people, and unfortunately on the right, on the quote unquote conservative side, champion all this morality, and oftentimes they themselves are caught in immorality, right? And you have to, and this is why I've said in the past before that I blame a lot of what's happening in America, not on the left, but on the churches. An honest person reads the Bible and says to themselves, seems like it's the seventh day, but then the church comes up with all these twists of how to explain that away. You can't live with that kind of cognitive dissonance. And so subconsciously, then they twist other things. Well, now marriage can be between a man and a woman and a woman, because you can't start dismissing something and then try to stay faithful to the rest of it. It's either all matters or it doesn't. And this is why I like this. It is well reminded Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, and all other Christians, the Bible does not support them anywhere in the observance of Sunday. Sunday is an institution of the Roman Catholic Church, and those who observe the day observe a commandment of the Catholic Church. And they have a point. Honest. Yeah. And that's what I respect about Catholics. They're honest. They are they tell it like it is, because to them it's tradition plus scripture. And for Protestants, it's supposed to be only scripture. And yet, there's a guy I follow on, a Calvinist I follow on X, Solo Chad, and he posted the question, which is the commandment do you think Christians break the most? And people were like stealing, lying, coveting, yada, yada. And then I put the fourth commandment, knuckleheads. I didn't say knuckleheads, but I wrote the fourth commandment, and it got about over 700 views and a lot of retweets. And then people were like, "Yeah, that's it." I mean, and so the irony is that the Ten Commandments says the seventh day, and they were passing this legislation on the seventh day, and yet talking about honoring Sunday. Yeah. All right, you have now. This guy's not without fault, and so you got another clips that he seems to undermine his own position. Go ahead.
Well, and I'll set this up, right? So far, I've appreciated this guy's stand when it comes to Texas, but he's a Democrat legislature. Which, listen, a Democrat could be someone of principle. There was a time when there used to be a lot of pro-life Democrats, actually. But today, in our polarized world, unfortunately, most people just fall into whatever their party says they should have on any particular issue. And the reason why I want to bring up both sets of clips, right? So now we've agreed with him. Listen, if Representative Tallarico ever sees this, he'd love to have you on to have a friendly conversation.
Yeah.
I'll reach out to his office. I just
yeah, go ahead.
But the reason why I think these other clips are important to talk about is the separation of church and state, I think, is an important principle. It protects the church and it protects the state, right? It keeps both from mingling, right? Because we've seen in history, persecution always follows the mingling of the ecclesiastical authority and the civil power, right? So it's an important principle, and he's bringing it up, and that's good. We should have a discussion about it. But one of the things that I think harms this principle in the mind of many Christians is that there has been, by secularists, a false or a rewriting of what the separation of church and state means, right? Or that it means that there should be no discussion of morality in law or in politics or in, well, that's not ever what it meant, right? That's not what it meant to Roger Williams. That in our tradition, that's not what it meant to our Adventist forebears, who also very much believe this. That's not what it meant to any of the, Baptists or others who came to this country searching for religious freedom. What it meant was, as we've delineated many times on this channel, is that the Ten Commandments, right? They kind of illustrate two laws, right? The first four commandments, God, our relationship with God, and it is blasphemous for the state to impose on that because God wants free will worship. The last six commandments have to do with our relationship with our fellow man, and that's the realm of the civil power. And so in these next two clips, right, we'll play them and then we'll kind of discuss why we think he's getting that line wrong.
Okay. All right. Ready?
What is the fourth commandment?
It seems like you sent me it twice.
This
then
bill
let's go.
is insane. This legislature legalized hemp 6 years ago. But instead of regulating, this bill is insane. This legislature legalized hemp.
That's not it.
6 years ago. But instead of regulating this booming industry in our state, we are now going backwards to the days of prohibition. Texans will still use THC,
well,
but
it's short.
of getting it safely from a local small business, they'll now get it from the black market, from the drug cartels. This ban is a gift to the cartels. We are now telling full-grown adults how to live their lives. This is the nanny state at its worst. This is big government at its worst. I thought the Republican Party believed in limited government and personal responsibility. What gives us the right to tell an adult what to do on their own time? This bill is insane.
You know what? I mean, you probably didn't intend this to happen, but it actually undermines his previous point, right? The separation of church and state. And you just talked about our relationship with God has to do with the first 4 commandments. Well, the last 6 commandments, the state can regulate, and the state has an interest in the health of its people. And drugs are bad. There are certain things we can regulate. We don't let kids drink alcohol. We don't let people do cocaine. And I think the experiment with weed has already shown that it's detrimental to society. They tried it. Time to reverse it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like I said, I didn't even know he had this clip on drugs. I don't know where that one came from. But no,
providential.
Right. In other words, the separation of church and state, and he didn't actually make that appeal as far as the drugs were concerned. But yeah, when there's harmful substances, right, we can have laws on those things. I don't know if I did send you the other clip, but
you sent me one from Joe Rogan.
Yeah, let's play that one. And then that'll make the point even more clear.
What do you think is the biblical evidence to support the opinion of being pro-abortion?
Mary is probably my favorite figure in the Bible, the mother of Jesus. And, you know, she's an oppressed peasant teenage girl living in poverty under an oppressive empire as a Jew. And she has a vision from God that she's going to give birth to a baby who's going to bring the powerful down from their thrones. God asks for Mary's consent, which is remarkable. I mean, go back and read this in Luke. I mean, the angel comes down and asks Mary if this is something she wants to do. And she says, if it is God's will, let it be done. Let it be. Let it happen. So to me, that is an affirmation in one of our most central stories that creation has to be done with consent. You cannot force someone to create. Creation is one of the most sacred acts that we engage in as human beings, but that has to be done with consent. It has to be done with freedom, and to me, that is absolutely consistent with the ministry and life and death of Jesus. And so that's how I come down on that side of the issue. Again, I'm very open for my fellow Christians to disagree with that, and they may have scriptural passages they point to be anti-abortion. And I think that's a debate that we should feel comfortable having. All I'm saying is that it shouldn't be assumed that just because you're a Christian, you are anti-gay or anti-abortion, because there are so many Christians out there who don't subscribe to either of those policy positions.
So there's a lot of nuance if you're talking about abortion, right? Because you're not just talking about a woman's right to choose, but you're also talking about and incest.
That's right.
Right. So you're talking about a woman's right to choose whether or not she carries a baby when it was not her choice to begin with.
That's right. And it's why I think that almost everyone in this country is pro-choice to some extent.
What do you think is the biblical evidence to support the opinion of...
All right. Your thoughts.
Yeah. So, again, and this is, to be fair, in a polarized country, this is a Democrat being a Democrat, right? And the Democratic Party says, you know, you're pro-abortion. And so even if you're a Christian, right, you got to justify that position. But, and in a longer context, right, he talks about this in the context of, like he talks about those 10 commandments, right? People can go and watch his episode on Joe Rogan. But he talks about, in other words, he says, Christian nationalists, this is basically Christian nationalists, they want to enforce, you know, Christian laws, right? Christianity on society. Now that's true. And his example, the stuff that we talked about at first, right? The stuff with forcing the 10 commandments in public schools, right? These type of things are an example of that, right? Because the government is enforcing on the first 4 commandments. But when he talks about marriage the way he does, when he talks about the Ten Commandments, he's on the other side of the separation of church and state argument, right? Because as we've gone through, those are things that the state does have um, a legitimate claim to. And so not only do I think, we need to talk about what is the separation of church and state, which we have, but then also we need to come down to what are natural rights, right? Like I feel like root of so many of our disagreements, right? Because everyone claims a right.
Yep.
But the government can only protect so many things. And so I think it's important that we have an objective standard by which we judge rights. And I believe that the founders had one, right? And I think that we had that kind of common understanding. And I think progressives, right, particularly starting in really at the beginning of the 20th century, grew an expanded one that makes it so that the conversation on rights actually becomes almost useless.
Yeah, they expanded it so much, nobody seems to have rights. Even a person like Bill Maher, who is pro-abortion, but at least he's clear knowing that it is the murder of a baby, basically. He says it. And so for us who are conservative and trying to use natural law, you realize, as you were saying, everybody has rights. And yet people seem to side on the person, aka the mother, who had the adult mind, who had the awareness to make choices, because 90 something percent of abortions are not rape and incest, right? Who had the choice. And yet, for some reason, because out of sight, out of mind, we don't protect the rights of the weak and the vulnerable, which is the children, right? No one would do that to a 9-month-old, who's been born, right? Or even a 3-week-old who's been born. Why in the womb? And that's why natural law says you have to protect all of them. And look, I have family, without getting into detail, who are a product of date rape. And they're loved. They're part of the family. But that was how they were conceived. And their mother decided, life is more important than what happened to me. Now, I don't know if they would have thought differently had it been a like a violent rape from a stranger. It was date rape. Not that makes it any better, but I don't know. People have talked that it's different, right? Because sometimes you feel guilty in a date rape, whether it was your fault or not. And regardless, I'm glad this person's alive, this family member's alive, and it is. They deserve life. God can right any wrong in the end.
Yeah. And one of the reasons, right, and the particular religious, what do you call it? Some people say, well, the founders were deists, right? So, and then Christians say, no, committed Christians. I think the truth is somewhere in between. A lot of them were deists, but there was certainly faithful Christians among them. But they all agreed, right, that the church and state should be separate, and that natural law, right, is the basis of, right, this compact theory, really is what it is, right? Because the American founding was really a Lockean revolution, right? If the French Revolution was based on Rousseau, right, with problems that followed, the American Revolution, and much of what made it successful, is that it was much more Lockean, right? Which was Locke was basically, I mean, he's referred to as like a political philosopher. He was really a Protestant theologian and he talked about natural law and natural rights. And the thing about the natural law, right, and yes, we understand, right, and the Declaration says it, right, all men are created equal, right, and there's this idea of nature and nature's God. And the point of this is not that we downplay biblical revelation or special revelation.
Yeah.
We're Christians, right? We believe that is absolutely true, and that you should follow the Bible. But when it comes to the matter of political society, right, it is important that this principle of consent, and then this idea that we enter a social contract, right? And we can draw, right? The reason why natural law is not just some theocracy, but it's the idea of we can draw certain things by the nature, by human nature, right? Romans 1, right, talks about this from the biblical side. There's certain things that we can draw, right? So in other words, this idea that there is nature and nature's God says that there are certain things that man, if man is created in the image of God, there's certain duties that man would have to God, right? And that the state does not have a right to impede those, right? So we can draw religious liberty for everyone from the natural law. We can draw that if we're made in the image of God, right, we shouldn't be killed, right? And so that gives an individual right to life, right? Somebody doesn't have to kill you. Someone doesn't. You don't have a right to kill someone else, right? Like they have a right to life. You have a right to life. The unborn have a right to life. So these things can be drawn from the natural law, right? But when you start, and this kind of goes into the expanded, right? Tallarico talked about, not in that clip, but one of the things he talked about is gay marriage, right? And it's often talked, it's framed as an issue of rights. Now, I want to be very clear. LGBTQ people have rights. They're human beings. They have the same right to life. They have a right to, property, these things that we can derive from the natural law. But marriage is a particular thing. So, like, I don't want to live in, like, just being honest here, I don't want to go back to a society, right? I don't want to live in a Christian version of Iran where gay people can just be rounded up and dragged into,
thrown off buildings.
I think, the state should be broadly tolerant of what people do in their private lives as adults. But that doesn't change the fact that marriage is what it is. And you can't have a right. Like, I don't have a right to, I don't have a right to define that the sky is pink, is pretty pink, right? Like, the sky is blue. Doesn't matter. Like, I can say whatever I want, but society has a right to be like, yeah, that guy's nuts. Is between a man and a woman, right? Like, we can see from the natural law that a coupling of two men or a coupling of two women is different than a coupling of a man and a woman, right? Namely, only one of those can propagate the species, right? And so, listen, we can have a debate about how permissive society should be, right? We don't want a nanny state, right? And so all these things. But at the end of the day, society's number one interest when it comes to marriage, right? Like, is not the relationship between the two adults, but it's what are we going to do with children, right? What are we going to do? And so now, and this is where it comes up, right? When gay marriage is seen as a civil right, well, who gets lost in that? Katie Faust, she's a child advocate. She illustrates a lot, but it's children, right? It's, in other words, for the sake of the pleasure of adults, we've subjugated the rights of children. And I'm sorry, and I'm going to be labeled a bigot, right? If right-wing watch that channel ever get a clip of this, they're going to have a clip and it'll be like, this right-wing crazy person is going against the rights of gay people. It's like, I'm sorry, but a child has a right that when there's a situation where the state has to intervene and decide where they go, they have a right for the state to preference a family that it closest approximates a real family. And I'm sorry, but two daddies is not a thing. Two mommies is not a thing. You can live how you want in your private life, okay? Keep it in the private. But children have a right to a mother and a father. And society has a right to privilege that coupling, right? And when we treat that in the same thing as religious liberty, right, we actually weaken the case for the separation of church and state and religious liberty, because now it's just arbitrary.
Yeah, and that's where forgot the ruling, but the codified gay marriages, Oberfeld, was so erroneous. I mean, they created it out of thin air, almost as an experiment, which leads me to believe that it might get reversed at some point, because that was such flaky ground that somebody in the future may look at it and be like, nah, this ain't standing. Or they will rule for it, and make better arguments. Going back to the natural law thing, I like to think this way, right? when it comes to the natural law, that the natural law will bring everybody to biblical principles if the arguments for it are persuasive enough, because it's just based on logic. In the end, it's better for humanity. Forget the fact that they end up being biblical principles. The natural law really is the best for a flourishing society. And the problem is when you get Christian nationalists who want to enforce it by brute force. It's almost they can't think through or be persuasive. But the truth is, not everybody's going to be persuaded. But you can live in a society where somebody else doesn't agree, right? I can live in a society, I do so now, right, where I don't agree with everything in a society. And so you're always going to have people that disagree. But I think if you follow natural law and we can make persuasive arguments and make good laws that they do not violate that separation of church and state, we can have, in theory, not going to happen because the Bible tells us iniquity is abounding and things are going to get worse. But in theory, we can have a Christian nation without necessarily calling it that, because if natural law prevails, that's what it looks like.
And I would say this. Obviously, we're Christians, right? So we believe in special revelation, right?
Mm-hmm.
God actually,
yeah.
miracles happen, right? And I like a point that Andrew Clavin made. He did this response video to some TikTok atheists, and they were bringing up how, these miracles don't happen. And Andrew Clavin made the point, like, Christians also believe that those things don't happen, right? That the dead don't get up, right? The sick, like these things don't happen. He's like, that's why we call them miracles.
Exactly.
Right? Natural course of things, those things don't happen, right? But God, acting in history, does these things. So listen, I would never say that natural law alone is sufficient for salvation, because at the end of the day, those truths, you do have to come to God in faith. You have to take him at his word. You have to believe that Jesus Christ is who he said he was, that he lived a sinless life, that he died, and that he rose again. And you have to believe that by faith, right? And so special revelation is important, right? That's right. We're never going to stop preaching the gospel. We're never going to stop spreading the three angels' messages, because the Bible is important. And that's why one of the reasons religious liberty is so important is so that we have the freedom to make those persuasive arguments from the gospel to urge people to believe it. But what natural
hold on though, real quick, in Romans chapter 1, it says there's sufficient evidence in nature that they will be without excuse. I know what you mean, but I wanted to clarify that. In Romans chapter 2, it also says when those who do not have the law behave like they do have the law, it shows that the law is written in their hearts. They may not necessarily acknowledge the gospel. One other thing about miracles, true story, heard it directly from the pastor's mouth here in the United States. A demon possession that him and his elders were able to spend 45 minutes praying over and singing while the person was wreathing and screaming and everything. That's the first time I've ever heard of somebody I know personally. This is a friend of mine who had to deal with this past Saturday in church. Ironically, after a week of prayer, they were asking for the Holy Spirit to be poured upon the church and asking for the Holy Spirit to lead them. It's almost like the Holy Spirit was preparing them to face this demonic. This is stuff that I have to admit, you hear about in Africa and South America, happen here in the United States. And it's the first time it's somebody I know very closely. And obviously there's evidence, so it wasn't just him and the person, the elders and other teachers and security guards, and they all saw it. And we fight against not flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers. So this stuff is real.
So I'm going to respond to your previous point, but before that, on that point, Ryan has talked about how even here where I'm from in Southwest Michigan, he's gotten calls about these types of things. It goes on much more than much more than people think. one of the points that he made, and this is something why it's so important as Christians that we're keeping our walk with the Lord, that we're confessing our sins, is that a lot of pastors that he's dealt with don't want anything to do with this stuff. They'll stay totally away, because the thing is, the demons, they don't play around, right? Like
No.
if you are going into a situation half baked with secret sins, all these things, the demons, they know these things, right? They can't read your mind, but they
Yeah.
can see your actions that are secret from other people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you got some secret sin, what are you saying is that there's a lot of pastors who they don't want to be in that situation to even pray over these people, because they're afraid, right, that the demons are going to be like, hey, Frankie, I know what you do at 2 a.m, right? And
Yeah.
they expose that. And so it is so important, because the more we realize,
Remember that story in Acts where the sons of Sceva tried? Hey, Paul, I know, and Jesus, I know, but who are you? That's a funny story, really.
yeah. So on your other point, yes, it's true.
Mm-hmm.
But that people will be without excuse, particularly when it comes to law. But what I mean is, you can, if I believe the Holy Spirit is drawing everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
If in the name of Christ, they're trying to bring them in a situation where they would be ready to receive and all these things. And there are people who are more receptive to that, right? Even if they haven't heard the gospel. But yet, apart from from special revelation, you're not going to come to the Trinity. Apart from special revelation, you're not going to come to the specifics of Jesus of Nazareth, right? In other words,
No, yeah.
right, you know what I mean? Like, you're not going to see through natural law, like the way that you can see that you're a human being, right? The way you can see that there is a God, right? Like, these things do from natural law, right? And back to people have rights, but you do as Christians, right? Special revelation is necessary. And so that's all I meant there.
Yeah. No doubt. I mean, how do I put it? You can pass the exam, quote unquote, and this is going to sound weird because we're saved by faith, by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. You can pass the exam without studying, aka natural law. But I'd rather pass the exam with having studied, right? Where you feel confident. And that's, special revelation when you know Jesus personally and you know that he can get you through whatever and he'll never leave you nor forsake you. As we wrap up, I'll let you have the final thought because I got things to do still at 9 p.m. my time.
Yeah. So I guess my final thought would be, it is important that in defending the separation of church and state, that we actually defend what it is, right? It's not some purely secular public square that says that when you go into the public square, you have to leave your faith behind, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not the idea that you can't argue for moral laws that do justice for the unborn or that define marriage properly, right? Like, that's not the separation of church and state, right? The separation of church and state comes down to your religious freedom, your worship, the idea that as Christians, we don't have the right to enforce our religion on atheists or Hindus, because the gospel must be freely chosen, right? And so, let's say we were to force all, like, this would be evil, we should not do it. We were to force every Hindu and Muslim and atheist in this country to go to church every week. Let's even say this would never happen, right? But, like, let's say it was even on the right day, it was on the Sabbath, right? And we would do that. We would have just as many Christians after that forcing as we had before, because you can drag a horse to water, you can't make him drink. You can dress up a pig like a businessman, but it's still a pig, right? In other words, unless there is, well, actually, the pig one wasn't really a good analogy.
Well, whatever.
You know what I mean? Like,
A man convinced against his opinion is of the same opinion still. Right?
yeah. So we should be loving, and to Talico's earlier points, right? We actually advance the gospel by defending other people's right to religious liberty. I'll give an example from, and we've talked about this before, from the mutual acquaintance of both of ours, Jonathan Chern. He's a Seventh-day Adventist lawyer, right? So he believes, like we do, that the Sabbath is on Saturday. And yet, in the famous case, Grok versus the Postal Service, he represented a fellow Christian who's a Sunday keeper. And this fired from his job at the Postal Service for not working on Sunday. And Jonathan, even though he doesn't agree with him on that theological claim, believes that he has a fundamental right to practice his faith according to the dictates of his conscience. And here's the plus side. You do that because it's right. And now that guy has a relationship with Jonathan. He cares about his opinion. He cares with him why he goes to church on Saturday. He's willing to listen. And that's true on all these things when it comes to worship. When we'll defend our non-Christian neighbors' right to religious freedom, their human right to religious freedom that they have as an image bearer, it opens up avenues for us to then share the gospel with them freely.
Yep. And that's the point. In the end, right? Who is our neighbor? Our neighbor is anyone who needs our help. And whether it's a Sunday keeper or a Hindu, if their religious freedom needs to be protected, may you be the one who champions their rights, because regardless of their religion, they are all created in the image of God. And God loves them, even though everybody will be held accountable. Until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, be blessed.